It was around 11 p.m. on a chilly autumn night when Eric received the Craigslist reply. He was selling an old leather armchair he'd inherited from his uncle's estate. The chair was faded, cracked along the arms, and creaked under weight, but it had character, a kind of worn-in elegance. Eric wanted it gone. He couldn't stand the smell of leather that seemed to cling to it. The message was short, barely 2 lines. Is the chair still available? We'll pay $500. There was no name attached, no further details. Just the promise of a good sum, well over the price Eric had listed. He felt a surge of excitement. After all, this was just an old chair, and $500 was too good to pass up. The buyer insisted on coming by that night. The speed of it was a little unsettling, but Eric shrugged it off. It was Craigslist, after all. People came in all stripes. He cleared some space in his cramped apartment and placed the chair in the center of the room, then started tidying up the mess around it. When he heard the knock, he felt a strange twinge of apprehension. A man stood in the hallway, silhouetted by the dim lights outside. He was tall, with broad shoulders, but the details of his face were hidden under the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat and thick, round glasses that reflected the hall's dull lighting. "Eric?" The man's voice was rough, low. He sounded like he was suppressing a cough. Yeah. You here for the chair?" "Yes," the man replied. He entered without waiting for an invitation, his coat brushing against the walls as he squeezed past Eric. As he moved closer to the chair, he seemed almost reverent. He took off his hat, revealing a gaunt, pallid face with hollow eyes that seemed too large for his face. His lips stretched into a thin, unsettling smile as he ran his fingers over the cracked leather. "This is it," he murmured, more to himself than to Eric. "Yes, I can feel it." "Feel what?" Eric asked, his unease intensifying. He tried to force a laugh, but it came out shaky. Nothing," the man said, breaking his trance. "Just an old family heirloom I've been searching for." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, holding it out to Eric. "Cash, as promised." Eric took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the man's cold, bony hand. He counted the money. It was all there, crisp bills smelling faintly of mildew. For a moment, he wanted to say something, to ask the man what he meant by feeling it, but he swallowed the words. It wasn't worth risking the sale. "Thanks, I guess," he muttered, stepping back. "Do you need help carrying it?" "No," the man replied, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Just leave us." The choice of words struck Eric as odd, but he decided not to question it. He backed away, watching as the man ran his hands along the chair's seams and curves as though it were a living creature. "Goodbye, Eric," he said, his eyes glinting in the dim light, his voice a raspy whisper. Eric forced a nod, quickly closing the door behind the man, and breathed a sigh of relief. Something about the encounter lingered, though, gnawing at his nerves. That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the man's face, those hollow eyes studying the chair, a look of hunger in his expression. The next morning, Eric found himself drawn back to Craigslist, scanning through the ads in a moment of morbid curiosity. Then, about halfway down the page, he froze. There it was, worn leather armchair for sale, $500. The photo was unmistakable. It was the same chair, right down to the scuff marks along the armrests. Eric clicked on the listing, but there were no details beyond a single sentence. This chair belonged to him. Serious inquiries only. His stomach churned. Was it possible the man had changed his mind and put it back up for sale? That didn't make any sense. Shaken, he logged off and tried to forget about it. Days passed, but the chair kept creeping back into his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, curiosity got the best of him. He clicked on the ad and sent a message under a fake name asking to see the chair. The response came almost immediately. Tonight, midnight. When the time came, Eric felt a pang of dread, but he found himself in front of the address listed, a decrepit old house, windows dark and overgrown with ivy. He hesitated, heart pounding, but then, against his better judgment, he knocked. The door opened, and he was face to face with the man from before. But this time, there was something even more unsettling in his appearance. He looked almost skeletal, his skin stretched so tightly across his face that it seemed translucent, veins visible beneath. "Eric," the man said, his voice barely a whisper. Eric's blood ran cold. He hadn't given his real name in the message. Why do you have the chair back?" Eric stammered. The man's lips curled into a smile, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than before. Oh, Eric, I never left it. He never left it. He gestured to the chair, now sitting in the corner of a nearly empty room. My father's spirit, it clings to this chair, feeding on whoever dares sit in it. What? What are you talking about? Eric took a step back. You don't feel it? The man leaned closer, and Eric caught a whiff of decay. He's in here, always has been. Watching, waiting. He's bound to this chair, but every soul that touches it fuels him. And now, Eric, he's hungry again. Eric's breath hitched as he looked toward the chair. Shadows seemed to dance across its surface, almost like veins pulsing under the leather. Panic clawed at his mind. He turned to leave, but the man stepped in front of him, blocking his way. Let me go, Eric managed, voice shaking. The man's hollow eyes stared him down, and he could feel the weight of something ancient, something hungry, pressing down on him. You wanted the chair gone, didn't you? He said, his voice barely more than a growl. You sold it to me, and now you can join him. Suddenly, the chair seemed to shift, its leather creaking as though something was moving within it. Shadows pooled around it, stretching toward Eric like tendrils. He stumbled back, his body freezing with terror as an inexplicable force pulled him closer. The last thing he saw was the man's hollow gaze, a glint of satisfaction in his sunken eyes as he whispered, Welcome home. The next morning, the Craigslist ad was updated. Worn leather armchair for sale, slightly used. Comes with character. Lily was ecstatic about her new apartment. The rent was suspiciously cheap, but she shrugged it off as a stroke of luck. The old building had a certain charm. Creaky wood floors, high ceilings, and heavy velvet curtains in deep dark red that hung over every window. She'd only been there a few days when she started noticing odd things. A faint smell of burning wood that lingered in her kitchen, flickering lights, and strangely the temperature dropping in just one corner of her bedroom. But the weirdest part was the letter. It came on her third night there. She found it slipped under her door, written in a spidery scrawl on yellowed paper. You're not alone here. When the clock strikes 3, he'll come to see you. Don't let him in. Lily's first instinct was to laugh it off, figuring it was some prank by a neighbor. The idea that her new apartment was haunted was ridiculous, right? She tossed the letter in the trash and forgot about it. That night, as she lay in bed, she started to doze off, but was jerked awake by a soft creaking from the hallway. She checked her phone. It was 2:59 a.m. As the clock ticked closer to 3, she heard something that made her blood run cold, a soft knock at the door. It was steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. She sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. It had to be some late-night visitor, a neighbor who'd had too much to drink, or something else. The knocking didn't stop. Thump, 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 thump. The clock turned to 3 a.m. The knock came again, louder, harder this time. She stayed absolutely still, not daring to move or make a sound. Her mind was racing, replaying the words from the letter. Don't let him in. But then in a voice that was low and calm, something that sounded almost human, she heard it. Lily. It was a whisper, muffled through the door but unmistakably familiar. Lily, it's me. Open the door. The voice sounded like her mother. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mother was miles away, back in another city, and hadn't visited her in years. But the voice, it was her, down to every inflection, every softness. Lily, it repeated, almost pleading, why won't you let me in? With trembling hands, she grabbed her phone and dialed her mom's number. It rang once, then twice, then, Lily? Her mother's voice, soft and groggy, answered. Is everything okay? The voice on the other side of the door grew angry, low and guttural. Lily, let me in. The door shook violently, as though someone were throwing their entire weight against it. She clutched her phone, paralyzed with fear, listening to her mother's concerned voice and this other, twisted voice screaming her name in the hall. When it finally stopped, she didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, she told her landlord, a grizzled old man named Mr. Hawthorne, about what had happened, half expecting him to laugh it off, but his face grew grave. He pulled her aside, lowering his voice to a whisper. You aren't the first, he said. Every few years, a new tenant moves into that unit. Every one of them says they get visitors around 3 a.m. A knock, a familiar voice. The last tenant even heard his dead wife crying outside his door. He shook his head. They always ask to be let in. But here's the thing. If you let them in, you don't leave. Lily felt a chill run down her spine, a deep dread settling in her bones. The letter, the knocks, the voice. What would have happened if she'd opened the door? She packed her bags that night and never looked back. The apartment went up for rent again the next day. A few weeks later, on a whim, she checked Craigslist. There it was, apartment available, fully furnished, $500 per month, ideal for single tenant. She could almost feel her blood freeze as she read the description. A charming one-bedroom with vintage decor, including heavy dark red velvet curtains, move-in ready. She shut off her computer, the memory of that night replaying in her mind, of her mother's voice outside her door, pleading, whispering, knocking. When Emily took the babysitting job, she didn't expect much beyond a long, boring night. The Smiths were a nice enough family, quiet and distant, who had moved to town just a month ago. Their house was in a secluded area near the edge of a dense forest, and she hadn't heard much about them, but they were paying well and she needed the cash. Mrs. Smith was oddly vague about their child. Her name is Lily, she'd said softly, her eyes flicking toward the hallway. She'll already be asleep upstairs. You shouldn't need to go to her unless she makes noise. Just let her be. It was an odd request, but Emily didn't think much of it. She agreed, and Mrs. Smith handed her an old flip phone. Use this to call if anything goes wrong, she said, eyes darting to Emily's cell. Our service isn't great here, and landlines don't work. It was unsettling, but Emily shrugged it off. After the Smiths left, she settled in for the night, scrolling through her phone as silence filled the house. Just past midnight, as she started nodding off, she heard something, soft, like a whimper or a faint cry. Ignoring the unease that prickled her skin, she went to the foot of the stairs, calling softly, "Lily, are you okay?" Silence. Then, barely audible, a faint, muffled voice floated down from the top of the stairs. "Help, me." Emily froze. The voice sounded young, pained, and weak. Heart pounding, she grabbed the old flip phone the Smiths had given her, dialing the number listed for Mr. and Mrs. Smith. But the line went dead before it even connected. She checked her cell phone, but there was no service, and she felt trapped in that quiet house with nothing but the cries of a little girl growing louder. "Please, help me." Against her better judgment, Emily took a step up the stairs. The voice grew louder, almost frantic, like the child was in some kind of pain. She crept down the dim hallway, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The house was utterly silent, yet the voice continued, desperate and pleading. "Emily." The voice was fainter now, a whisper right behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. Her heart raced, and she felt a sudden wave of dread as she continued toward the door at the end of the hall, where she assumed Lily's room must be. The air grew colder as she reached for the doorknob, every instinct in her body screaming at her to turn back. Taking a breath, she opened the door. The room was dark except for the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. A small bed sat in the corner, empty. The blankets were untouched, neatly tucked under the mattress. She turned on the light and found nothing. No child, no toys, nothing that suggested a child had ever even lived there. Emily's mind raced. Was someone messing with her? But then the faint whisper came again, this time from just behind her. "Help me." She whirled around, feeling a shiver run down her spine. There was no one there, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating. And then she saw it, the closet door, slightly ajar, something dark and shadowed just beyond. Summoning every ounce of courage, Emily reached for the door. Her hand shook as she pulled it open, revealing a space empty except for a mirror on the back wall, reflecting her terrified face back at her. But just as she was about to step away, the reflection flickered. In the mirror, behind her, stood a small, frail figure, a girl with pale skin, sunken eyes, and dark hair that hung in tangled strands around her face. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. "Help me," she mouthed, her eyes locking onto Emily's in desperation. Emily stumbled back, her heart hammering. The little girl in the mirror reached out, pressing a translucent hand against the glass as though trying to break through. Her mouth opened wider, her eyes darkening, and a guttural scream filled Emily's head, echoing through the empty room. She bolted from the room, running down the stairs and fumbling with the old phone. Her hands trembled as she dialed 911, praying someone would pick up. This time, the call connected. 911, what's your emergency?" Emily gasped, clutching the phone. I'm babysitting, and there's a girl here. She's trapped in the mirror." The line went silent, then a crackling noise filled her ear. When a voice returned, it was cold and flat. "Get out of that house, now." The urgency in the operator's voice snapped her out of her shock, and she bolted for the door, grabbing her bag as she ran outside. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road. She called her parents from a nearby gas station, barely able to explain what had happened. The Smiths never called her back, nor did she ever see them again. A few weeks later, she heard a news report about the house. Years ago, the previous owners had lost their daughter, Lily, in a tragic accident. She'd fallen down the stairs and broken her neck, dying instantly. The mother was so overcome with grief that she spent months convinced her daughter's spirit was still in the house. She'd stare into mirrors, whispering for her lost daughter, believing Lily was trapped on the other side. When Emily passed by the house a few years later, it was abandoned. She peered through the window out of morbid curiosity, her heart pounding. There, in the dimness of the hall mirror, she thought she saw the faintest outline of a small handprint pressed against the glass, almost as if someone was trying to break free. Mark was a college student with bills piling up, so when he found an ad online for a job delivering packages, he jumped at the chance. The instructions were strange, but clear. Pick up packages from a location in the middle of the city at midnight. Deliver them to specific addresses, and no matter what happened, do not open the packages. The pay was great, cash under the table, so he didn't ask too many questions. On his first night, he arrived at an abandoned-looking warehouse downtown. A single package was waiting for him, wrapped in old brown paper and sealed with thick black tape. It was surprisingly light, but something inside shifted when he picked it up, like a gentle tapping. A quick glance at the label showed an address he didn't recognize, on the outskirts of town. The night was cold, the streets nearly empty as he drove out past the city limits. As he followed the directions, his GPS blinked off and on, distorting the route, as though even it couldn't recognize the address. The road grew darker, trees lining either side, towering over his small car. The sense of isolation was unnerving, but he kept driving, finally spotting a house at the end of a narrow dirt path. The place was a wreck, the windows shattered, the roof sagging, as if it hadn't seen a resident in decades. He double-checked the address, hoping it was a mistake, but it was correct. When he stepped out of his car, he heard a faint whispering, soft, indistinct words he couldn't quite make out. He brushed it off as the wind, grabbed the package, and approached the front door. Just as he was about to leave the package on the porch, he heard a noise from inside. It sounded like someone shuffling, dragging their feet slowly across the floor. Against his better judgment, he knocked. A faint voice called out, raspy and broken, "Come in." Mark took a step back, heart pounding. There was no way he was going inside. He put the package on the porch and turned to leave, but then something caught his eye, a figure standing in the window, barely visible in the darkness. It was a woman, with hair matted to her face, her eyes hollow and staring straight at him. "Please, come in," she whispered, her voice thin as a spider's thread. Mark's hand tightened around his car keys, his legs almost giving out under him. He backed away, nearly stumbling over his own feet. He climbed into his car and drove off, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. As he reached the main road, he checked his rearview mirror and nearly screamed. There was someone in his back seat, a shadowy figure sitting perfectly still, just out of the glow of the streetlights. Who's there?" He choked out, his voice shaking. No response. The figure just sat there, unmoving. He could barely make out its face, but what little he could see looked gaunt, skeletal, with dark eyes that seemed to watch him from another plane entirely. Terrified, he swerved to the side of the road, jumping out of the car, but when he looked in the back seat, it was empty. His breath came in shallow gasps, and he shook his head, trying to convince himself he was just seeing things, that his mind was playing tricks on him. Determined to finish the job, he returned to the warehouse at midnight the next night. This time, there were 3 packages waiting for him. The moment he picked up the first one, he felt a strange warmth pulsing from within, like something alive was trapped inside. The tapping sound was louder now, like faint knocks, but he tried to ignore it. The first address was a rundown apartment complex across town. Mark walked to the door, feeling the package's warmth radiate through his hands, and knocked. After a few moments, the door creaked open, but no one was there. Just darkness, an empty apartment that smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. He stepped inside, calling out, but the only answer was silence. It was a stark, unnatural silence, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck rise. He placed the package on a dusty table near the entrance and turned to leave. Just as he reached the door, he heard a whisper, so faint he could barely make out the words. "Thank you for setting me free." A chill ran down his spine, but he didn't turn back. He ran down the stairs, heart pounding, telling himself it was just his imagination. By the time he got to the last address, a creepy, isolated farmhouse surrounded by tall, withered grass, he was jumpy, his nerves frayed. He approached the door, and as he raised his fist to knock, it opened before he even touched it. Inside, a man sat in a wheelchair, his face pale and gaunt. "You brought it, didn't you?" he rasped. Mark nodded, hesitantly holding out the package. The man's hand trembled as he took it, his gaze fixed on the package with a strange intensity. "I knew they'd come for me eventually," he whispered. Mark backed away, unsure of what was happening. Just as he turned to leave, the man's voice stopped him. "You've done well to bring us together, but you've touched it now. You've carried it." Confused and afraid, Mark stammered, "What do you mean?" The man's eyes grew wide, almost pitying. "It's attached to you now. You'll carry them until they find another. They cling to life, seeking those foolish enough to carry them." Mark felt his skin crawl as he stumbled back to his car, driving off with no clear sense of direction. But no matter how far he drove, the sense of something heavy, something watching, wouldn't leave him. When he got back to his apartment, he saw it, sitting on his kitchen counter, wrapped in brown paper and black tape. Another package. He hadn't picked it up, hadn't brought it inside. And when he looked closer, he could see the edges peeling back, something shifting inside, as though whatever was inside was scratching, tapping, waiting. The last thing he heard that night was a whisper, soft but unmistakable. "You'll carry us, Mark, forever." Jordan lived a quiet life in a small, sleepy town. He worked from home as a graphic designer, enjoyed his solitude, and didn't mind the silence around his rural house. One night, though, he received a strange knock at the door. It was nearly midnight, and he wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitant, he peeked through the window. A man stood on his porch, shivering in the cold, his head down and his hands clutching something wrapped in cloth. Jordan opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" he asked cautiously. The man looked up, his eyes wide and glassy, as though he hadn't slept in days. "Please, it's freezing," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Can I come in?" Against his better judgment, Jordan let him in. He figured the guy was probably lost or needed directions, and his small-town hospitality took over. Once inside, the stranger sat on the couch, clutching the cloth bundle tightly, like it was the most precious thing in the world. "What brings you here at this hour?" Jordan asked. The man's gaze drifted to the fireplace, his voice soft. I needed to bring her somewhere safe." Jordan's stomach twisted. "Her?" The man unwrapped the cloth, revealing an old porcelain doll. Its face was cracked, its eyes closed, and its dress was faded like it had been forgotten for years. Right, but something about it unsettled Jordan. The way it almost seemed to breathe, the tiny scratches on its face, the way the stranger looked at it as though it were alive. "Isn't she beautiful?" the man murmured, his voice breaking. "I've been carrying her for years. She doesn't like it when I'm alone." Jordan cleared his throat, an uncomfortable chill creeping up his spine. "I'm sorry, but why did you come here?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he held the doll closer and whispered, "You'll take good care of her, won't you?" "Listen, I think maybe you should go," Jordan said, trying to keep his voice steady. The doll's closed eyes seemed to almost flicker, like they were trying to open. "I can't take her any further," the man whispered, his voice filled with desperation. "She chooses people, and tonight she chose you." Jordan stepped back, suddenly realizing that the man had no intention of leaving. The stranger placed the doll gently on the couch and stood, his face a mask of relief mixed with sorrow. "You don't know what she's like when she's angry," he said, his voice barely audible. "If you don't keep her happy, she'll find a way to make you suffer." The man left quickly, slipping out the door and vanishing into the darkness, leaving the doll behind. Jordan stood there, frozen, staring at the doll's cracked face, its painted smile looking almost mocking in the dim light. He didn't know what to do with it, but as he reached out to pick it up, he heard it. A faint, almost childlike giggle. He pulled his hand back, his heart pounding. The doll was still, lifeless, its eyes closed as they had been. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just his nerves, just his imagination. As the hours dragged on, Jordan tried to ignore the doll, leaving it on the couch and heading upstairs to bed. But as he settled in, he heard it again. The same faint giggle drifting up from downstairs. Then a soft tap, 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 like tiny footsteps on the hardwood floor. He lay still, clutching the blankets, his breath shallow. The tapping grew louder, closer, as though something was climbing the stairs. He held his breath, his eyes fixed on his bedroom door. He told himself it was impossible, that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But then he saw it. The faintest shadow at the bottom of his door, like something small and crouched, was waiting outside. Then a whisper, barely audible. "Won't you come play with me?" He jolted up, heart pounding, convinced it was all a nightmare. But then he heard it again, the giggle, this time right by his bedside. Trembling, he turned on the lamp. The doll was sitting on his nightstand, its eyes open now, staring directly at him. He leapt out of bed, heart pounding, and grabbed the doll, rushing downstairs and throwing it into the fireplace. He watched as the flames licked at its porcelain skin, twisting and blackening the doll's face. A shaky breath relieved, convinced he'd gotten rid of it. But as he turned to go back upstairs, he heard a tiny, enraged scream from the flames, a voice that seemed to crawl under his skin and freeze his blood. "You think you can get rid of me that easily?" The doll, now half burned, sat in the flames, its head turning to face him, one cracked eye still glaring with pure hatred. He backed away, horrified, but the doll didn't stop. Its lips, warped and melted, twisted into a sneer. "You're mine now," it whispered, the voice a guttural growl. Jordan fled the house, driving all night to the next town. He never returned, but he heard rumors from neighbors who swore they still saw a light in his house at night, and sometimes they heard faint giggling through the walls. And every so often, the doll would appear in the front window, its charred face peering out as though waiting for its next visitor. Rumor had it that anyone who stayed in the house too long would eventually start to hear the doll's voice, whispering, pleading, asking to be set free. But no one ever stayed long enough to find out what would happen if they said yes.